Episode 171, Defeating Tom. Tom hesitated for a bit because he didn't expect that Jacob would make such a request. What he planned originally was to utilize the chance of testing Jacob's realm and rush violent energy into Jacob's body and mess up the allocations in his body. It was like a pool that could only contain 1,000 liters, but suddenly got caught in 10,000 liters of water. The process would definitely be extremely painful and could even destroy his meridians. His identity was the inspector on patrol. Even if this matter would break his relationship with the North Atlantic, he didn't have to worry about it. He wanted to get revenge for what happened last time. However, as for that sphere, I still don't know how to cast it, though Mr. Lester wouldn't mind my suggestion, right? Jacob continued. Jacob said one sentence after the other. It made Tom seem like he was afraid if he didn't battle against him. Fine, bring it on if you want to fight. He wore a silver suit and looked handsome. Yet he didn't even want to take off his jacket fighting against Jacob. Jacob was more cautious as he unbuttoned the jacket of his black suit and handed it to Helen, who stood nearby. He only wore a striped dress shirt. Sophie, who was chatting with Susan, dragged Susan along and walked over when she saw the situation wasn't looking good. Her striped blouse was a matching set with Jacob's, and it could be seen as a couple outfit. It looked like a deliberate choice that Helen had made while picking those outfits for them to make sure that nobody has any doubts about their relationship. In the presence of many seniors, I, Tom, am unwilling to bully a young kid and will temporarily reduce myself to first level. It'll count toward my defeat if any of my moves are above first level. Tom looked around and said confidently. People backed off a few steps and left them with a circle of 3 to 4 meters in diameter. The power of the first level was just like tickles to these guests. How powerful could the attacks of a 7 or 8-year-old kid be? As for those kids, they wouldn't encounter any danger because the elders would protect them. Therefore, no one cared about them battling without a sphere. Jacob walked up 2 steps and revolved the sword shadow scroll. Sophie, who stood outside of the site, held Susan's hand and was slightly nervous.
Jacob took the initiative and challenged Tom. What's going on?
Susan didn't quite get it either. Even if he had demoted himself to first level, Tom's practical experience couldn't be neglected. Even a person on the 2nd level might not be able to win against a 7th level master who only uses the power of first level. Please. Jacob leaned forward slightly and reached out his hands. Tom just snorted coldly. Since it was a battle between first levels, he wouldn't take out his treasure. He held his fists tightly and stared at Jacob. Metal elemental cultivation techniques were known for their sharpness. As long as the energy was revolving in the cultivator's hands, one could also easily chop iron. In the cultivation technique of the 5 elements, the metal element had the highest attack power. It was high enough that it could reach the power of treasures just by utilizing one's fists and legs. Jacob released a long breath, and his middle finger suddenly flicked forward. A long and narrow white sword energy flew toward Tom. Metal elemental sword energy. Tom opened his palm, faced the sword energy, and directly broke it into pieces. Jacob didn't show any disappointment. He waved his hand again, and another red sword energy flew toward Tom. Fire elemental sword energy. Again, Tom didn't panic at all. He randomly hit with his hand and turned the weak sword energy into pieces of energy. Susan sighed slightly. This sword shadow scroll is indeed flashy, yet not practical. The offense power of its early stage was weak as hell, and it was still unknown whether or not one could cultivate it until the late stages. Jacob's face was solemn, as if he couldn't be careless at all. He swung his hand and threw out another ray of green sword energy. Wood elemental sword energy. Tom didn't even have to use his hand, but inhaled a deep breath in and blew forward. This green, splendid-looking sword energy was blown away immediately. A few kids who were watching couldn't stifle their laughter. Jacob's attack looked great, but wasn't even as good as their attacks. Elder David, who stood by the side, looked at Jacob and Tom, who were still fighting in the circle, and smiled.
It's interesting how this guy actually knows how to utilize the cultivation technique of the 5 elements. However, his attack power is kind of weak.
3 attacks without hitting the target made Jacob anxious. Sword energies of the 5 elements shot out randomly. Metal, wood, water, fire, and earth corresponded with white, green, blue, red, and yellow. They looked like fireworks that didn't cost money and shot continuously toward Tom. Tom revolved the cultivation technique in his palms leisurely and broke these ticklish sword energies. He could deal with more complicated and more chaotic attacks than this. Therefore, he was simply depleting Jacob's energy and saw him as a joke. Jacob, who stood on the site, seemed like he couldn't handle the situation. He released the sword energy and backed off at the same time. His back bumped into Elder David's body and almost fell. He panicked and placed his hand there for support. At that, the kids laughed even louder. They didn't support anyone and only laughed at whoever made a fool of themselves. At the same time, Elder David felt a trace of nature energy flowing out from the front of his body. Jacob's finger shot out another ray of green sword energy again. His posture was unbalanced, as if he was scared Tom would come closer. Tom didn't care and waved with a palm to block this sword energy. Green sword energy suddenly exploded in his palm. Tom, who had no defense, walked back 6 steps abruptly. He looked at his palm again, and it was jet black. If he was in the realm of the 7th level, he wouldn't need to be afraid of this type of attack. However, he had demoted himself to the realm of 1st level. Jacob's attack power that he threw out just now was at least the attack power of 2nd level. Jacob didn't even give him a chance to check nor gasp as he followed his attack with another 3 rays of green wood elemental sword energy. Tom couldn't block and couldn't hide either. A light veil appeared in his hands to defend. A wave of fluctuations came from the defensive veil of 1st level. The 3rd sword energy pierced through it. Tom clamped the sword energy hastily with both of his hands. The sword energy exploded in his hands when it encountered an obstacle. Tom was covered in ashes due to the explosion. His handsome and clean face was suddenly covered in black smoke. Jacob didn't even give him time to adjust and threw out another 3 rays of wood elemental sword energies. Elder David, who stood on the side, felt his genuine energy flow out of his body. Even though his majestic cultivation power and the lost energy were insignificant, he understood where Jacob's sword energies came from.
What kind of technique is this kid cultivating?
Elder David, who was knowledgeable, began to wonder. He could control the leakage of the nature essence by controlling it through his mind, and 1st level Jacob wouldn't be able to borrow any. However, today he was here to eat at Sophie's birthday dinner, and he couldn't expose it. He could only let Jacob grab his nature essence bit by bit. Yet, Jacob felt bad for grabbing too much nature essence from the older man. He moved a few steps and stood in front of Elder Paul, who was looking at the situation. Elder Paul also felt his nature essence get sucked out. The suction was very weak. It felt like a mosquito bite, but it still got sucked a little. Jacob's hand shot out a red sword energy. Tom, who was about to clean his face, couldn't care less and grabbed his weaving shuttle-like treasure. The sword energy and the weaving shuttle clashed with each other and made an exploding sound. It seemed like the power of the sword's energy wasn't any weaker than the defense of the treasure. Jacob didn't hesitate and threw out another 3 rays of red sword energies. The remarkable ability of the Sword Shadow Scroll was its capability of absorbing elements, converting elements, and having 5 element sword energies. And the seniors who cultivated their cultivation techniques to their maximum were the purest elemental aggregate themselves. There weren't even a tiny bit of other elements in their bodies, and Jacob could randomly absorb any pure element. These elements couldn't be stored in the body, but they could help the Sword Shadow Scroll increase the damage and attack. 3 rays of fire-red sword energies rushed in front of Tom, and he didn't have a chance to dodge. If he could use the power of 7th level, the weaving shuttle could expand indefinitely and block these 3 rays of sword energies. Yet, he already promised to use the strength of the 1st level, and there were so many pairs of eyes watching him. He could only use the shuttle to block one, dodge another, and then use his bare hands to take down the last. The red sword energy exploded in Tom's hands. 5 elements could assist each other, but they could also counter each other. Metal countered wood, but fire countered metal. The fire elemental sword energy was a huge enemy to Tom's metal elemental cultivation technique. The rich fire element, borrowed from Elder Paul, encountered Tom's hands with metal elemental cultivation technique. The power was already strong enough, but at this moment it was unstoppable. Tom took 3 steps back abruptly, but still couldn't block this sword energy. The surrounding fire fragments left many cuts on his black suit. The sword energy burned out. Tom's hair also got burnt by the scorching temperature. At this moment, Tom didn't look as confident and elegant as earlier. He totally looked like a spiritless hobo. All was fair in battle. When Tom challenged him, Jacob already thought of his strategies, showing his weaknesses before showing his strengths. Elder Paul, who cultivated fire elemental cultivation techniques, had a bad temper. He was one of Helen's father's best friends, and he came out because of Helen this time as well. He didn't like this arrogant Tom. When Jacob absorbed the element again, he transferred stronger power into Jacob's hand of his own accord. Jacob felt his hands burn and threw it out with the technique of the Sword Shadow Scroll in a hurry. It was no longer a straight sword light that he threw out this time. It was a speedily flying phoenix. Phoenix's nirvana would burn the universe. This was the attack power of 3rd level. He would lose if he couldn't block it. He would also lose if he utilized a power higher than 1st level. Jacob had played him really well, made him say that he would only use the power of the 1st level, but never said anything about himself. Episode 172, The South Atlantic Dragon Clan. A blue light web flew from outside of the room and buckled the phoenix that was right in front of Tom. Water elements and fire elements were mingled together. The phoenix was wiped out, and the water elemental blue web evaporated and vanished. "Sorry, I'm late." An elder, dressed in a green robe, led many people and walked in from the door. He was the one who threw the blue light web. South Atlantic Dragon Clan. There were 50 to 60 people who came. The leading elder seemed like he was in his 60s. He was the overlord of the South Atlantic Dragon Palace, Grandmaster Hank, who had secluded himself for hundreds of years and just came out recently. The good-looking young man in luxurious clothing, standing beside Grandmaster Hank, was the Crown Prince of South Atlantic Palace, Henry. "It's such an honor to have you, Grandmaster Hank, here at Soph's birthday party." Dracon walked over and said politely. Grandmaster Hank glanced at Dracon, snorted, and simply nodded as a formality. In terms of seniority, Grandmaster Hank was 1 generation older. Even though Dracon wasn't too pleased, he couldn't really do anything. "Since this is Soph's birthday party, there's no need to fight." Grandmaster Hank glanced at Jacob and Tom and said, He helped Tom earlier, and he was now trying to stick up for him. "They're just fooling around." Dracon nodded and turned to Tom. "Does Mr. Lester still have any questions regarding Jacob's realm?" Tom gave him a cold glare and didn't reply. "Oh, is this the famous Jacob?" Grandmaster Hank moved his gaze to Jacob and carefully observed him. Jacob instantly felt like he was being seen through. The ice-cold gaze pierced through his body and made him feel uncomfortable. When Grandmaster Hank spoke, the young man beside him also stared at Jacob with animosity. Tom, who lost the match, was about to leave secretly. However, Susan stood out from the crowd and said,
"By the way, I have good news for you, Tom."
Tom turned suddenly and glared at Susan.
"I just received this news today. From now on, you won't have to be a patrolling inspector anymore and travel around so much. Dragon God Shrine appreciates your hard work and will send you to the Northwest Mountains to be a regional inspector starting tomorrow,"
Susan said. Hearing this news, half of Tom's face was still jet black, but the other half of his face turned from livid to pale. Mountains sounded like a great change, but they belonged to the harsh Northwest region. Sending him there as a regional inspector was almost like sending him into the frontier. Seeing Susan's calm yet pleased expression, Tom knew that she was telling the truth and asked, reluctantly, "Why all of a sudden?"
"I'm not too sure. It's an order from the headquarters. Maybe you offended a powerful cultivator and he or she reported you."
Tom gritted his teeth with force. He was disgraced right now and couldn't stay here anymore. His fists made a series of cracking noises as he walked away. As long as there were people, there would be situations and relationships. Inspectors also had preferences. Just like how Susan had a good relationship with the North Atlantic, Tom was leaning toward the South Atlantic. Grandmaster Hank watched Tom leave and was slightly caught by surprise. Tom was a patrolling inspector, but he was closely connected to the South Atlantic. He came to the North Atlantic clan in advance as a spy of the South Atlantic, yet the North Atlantic won in this round. Seeing Tom walking away with anger, Dracon laughed with Helen. He already knew that Tom leaned toward the South Atlantic. Even though they weren't afraid of him, he was still a threat to them in the city. Tom was suddenly moved to the Northwest by Dragon God Shrine. Even though they didn't know the reason, the North Atlantic got rid of the problem. Patrolling inspectors had the authority to stay in any city, and they could determine their schedule. If Tom wanted to stay in their city, Dracon and others couldn't do anything about it. Susan was happy as well because she liked to cultivate in peace. Tom had been dealing with some matters in Europe for the last 2 years, and that was the period she had the most prosperous cultivation progression. She definitely didn't like Tom bothering her. If the inspector system didn't prohibit inspectors from killing each other, she would have killed him through curses. Her offense ability wasn't as good as Tom's, but she had many ultimate techniques. If she had to, she would be willing to lose 5 years or 10 years of cultivation progress to give him a destructive, fatal blow. However, Tom seemed to be in love, yet afraid of this beautiful and crazy woman. He was in love with her beauty, but fearful of her fury. By the time Susan spoke, Henry, who stood beside Grandmaster Hank, finally spotted Sophie in the crowd. Sophie hid behind Susan when she saw Henry's stare.
"South Atlantic Dragon Palace, 1,000-year-old purple corals, 10 pieces of South Atlantic mystic ice."
The server, who was in charge of recording the list of gifts, yelled from outside the door. They arrived last, but their gifts were the most precious. 1,000-year-old purple coral could be made into elixirs, as well as become material for treasures. South Atlantic mystic ice was also the most precious treasure of the South Atlantic Dragon Palace, and it's also a type of mystic crystal for water elemental cultivation techniques. Every single mystic crystal was the most precious treasure of heaven and earth. They are rare and difficult to obtain. The South Atlantic Dragon Palace was located in a remote geographical region and didn't flourish in the cities that North Atlantic Dragon Palace resided in. However, they had the most valuable resource, which was the South Atlantic mystic ice. The annual production of South Atlantic mystic ice was 6 pieces, but the existence of the mystic ice was enough for them to train a lot of masters. When the elders of North Atlantic Dragon Palace were still in search of mystic crystals, the elders of South Atlantic Dragon Palace were already absorbing them steadily for their next-level cultivation. South Atlantic sent out nearly 2 years' worth of products of mystic crystal at once. This gift was indeed a very generous one. Even the representatives from the oceans were jealous. As long as they handed the 10 pieces of mystic ice to the elders, who almost broke through higher realms, and made them practice seclusion cultivation, even if some of them fail, they could still quickly generate 6 to 7 7th-level masters. Dracon was slightly surprised when he heard the list of presents and said loudly, "Grandmaster Hank, you went all out this time."
"Pleasure is all mine."
Grandmaster Hank nodded as if the presents were nothing special.
"South Atlantic and North Atlantic are future in-laws. These are necessary for building relationships."
Now that he mentioned it again, Dracon and Helen looked at each other with complicated expressions.
"What's the matter? Is our crown prince not worthy of your princess?"
Seeing Dracon and Helen not saying anything, Grandmaster Hank raised his voice and said, "Grandmaster Hank, Soph already has a prince consort," Dracon said.
"Who's that?"
Grandmaster Hank asked on purpose, as if he didn't already know the answer. "Jacob, who just won against Tom, is the prince consort of North Atlantic Dragon Palace," Dracon said with a calm tone. Grandmaster Hank snorted obnoxiously at that, and a powerful aura was released. Dracon and Helen, who were both only at top-tier 6th level, couldn't stand straight and stumbled backward immediately. Elder David and Elder Paul, who stood behind them, took a step forward in time and put their palms on their back, supporting them quietly. Grandmaster Hank was extremely arrogant. He was here as a guest, but he dared to be so rude to the host of the party, let alone the king and queen of another clan. Just when Dracon and Helen were suffocating and couldn't block the pressure coming from Grandmaster Hank anymore, a figure covered with shining blue light landed and struck Grandmaster Hank with a single hand. Grandmaster Hank blocked this strike, and their palms struck against each other. The fierce wind fluttered the tablecloth in the banquet hall, and those with weak cultivation power backed up multiple steps, no matter how close they stood. Grandmaster Hank also backed off 2 steps as his face turned pale. Kenneth, who stood in front of him, didn't move at all. It was clear who was stronger among them. Episode 173, Meeting the Kings.
"Grandmaster Hank, you've secluded yourself for hundreds of years, but I don't see any improvements. You're just afraid to trigger the heavenly tribulation, so you hid in the South Atlantic Dragon Palace. What kind of master is that?"
Kenneth shouted at him directly. Grandmaster Hank felt his anger burning in his chest. He wanted to retort, but didn't know what to say. South Atlantic had been craving for North Atlantic's territory and resources for a long time, but they didn't dare to do anything because of Kenneth's existence. Grandmaster Hank, their only hope, finally came out of the seclusion cultivation after many centuries, but he still wasn't a match for Kenneth. "You can only be around for so long. If you can't pass the heavenly tribulation, will there be any other masters in North Atlantic?" Henry, who stood beside Grandmaster Hank, yelled proudly. "Where did this dumb kid come from? How dare you interrupt me?" Kenneth waved his hand, and a blue light that was the same size as Henry appeared in midair and rushed toward Henry's head. Grandmaster Hank was still suffering from chest pains, but he threw out a blue light as well to protect his grandson. After an immense collision, the lights both collapsed. Grandmaster Hank couldn't help but take 3 steps back and almost spit out a gulp of blood. As expected, Kenneth had cultivated to the peak realm and was 1 step away from crossing heavenly tribulation. Grandmaster Hank was shocked and could only accept this fact. "Also," Kenneth took a few steps forward, "take these 10 mystic ice back." He pulled out a bag of 10 normal-looking white ice cubes and threw them at Grandmaster Hank. However, people with advanced cultivation techniques could see the blinking crystal cores inside. They were the natural mystic crystals that cultivators were dying to obtain. Grandmaster Hank caught the bag and glared at Kenneth. "We don't care about your mystic crystals." Kenneth raised his head. "Do you really think we would let Soph marry into your clan if we receive your mystic crystals?" Grandmaster Hank trembled in anger, but he had to keep his mouth shut because he wasn't as strong as Kenneth. He had thought that Kenneth was still in seclusion for the heavenly tribulation and wouldn't appear at this birthday party. It seemed like they had the wrong information. "Besides, how can we split them upon receiving? More than 100 elders in North Atlantic need these mystic crystals. You want the elders of our clan to fight amongst themselves and have the survivor take them all?" Kenneth said. The few North Atlantic elders looked at each other when they heard Kenneth's words. Indeed, they did crave the mystic ice when they heard South Atlantic gave 10 of them away. As Kenneth pointed out, they finally realized that South Atlantic wanted to make the elders fight for them and cause discord. It was because no matter how Dracon distributed the 10 mystic ice, there would always be dissatisfied elders. "Also, if all the elders seclude themselves for cultivation for 3 to 5 years, what would we do if there's an invasion?" Kenneth said again. Hearing Kenneth yell loudly, Dracon nodded silently. His younger brother was normally careless, but he wasn't foolish when it came to major incidents. Dracon also thought of these in-depth reasons, but it was difficult for him to refuse mystic ice, since he is the king. He didn't need to, though, because Kenneth revealed Grandmaster Hank's plots completely by making a scene. Grandmaster Hank laughed awkwardly. "Elder Kenneth, you worry too much. Nowadays, the whole world is at peace, and all the dragon clans are as close as a big family. How will there be an invasion?" "It's hard to say." Kenneth glanced at him and returned to the crowd. In fact, he had been in the banquet hall since Jacob and Tom started battling. He didn't want to help because he didn't like Jacob either and wanted Jacob to make a fool of himself in front of everybody. Nevertheless, he didn't expect Jacob to win, and so nicely at that. Jacob, who stood nearby, also slightly admired Kenneth's attention to detail when he heard him questioning Grandmaster Hank. He didn't know that when he and Sophie had visited the art district, Kenneth appeared suddenly because Tom was stalking them. Kenneth's malicious words, "I'll skin anyone who dares to trouble you," were actually for Tom, who was hiding in the darkness. It had effectively scared Tom away. "It's about time. Let's get the party started." Dracon looked around and said calmly, changing the subject. The crowd moved slowly, and everyone tried to find a seat. "Sit with us, Jacob," Helen called out to Jacob. "Okay," Jacob accepted frankly. Sophie also returned to her mother. She liked Susan's company, but Susan was an inspector and couldn't sit with Dracon's group. As a prince consort, Jacob sat down beside Sophie. They both wore complementing outfits and looked like a lovely pair underneath the spotlight. Dracon and Helen sat on the left side of Sophie, and Kenneth sat on the right side of Jacob. A few of the specially invited old seniors also sat at this main table accordingly. South Atlantic and North Atlantic's relationship seemed close on the surface. Therefore, their seats were close to the main table. However, through a few seniors' shoulders, Jacob could clearly see the South Atlantic prince's sinister gaze. Susan sat a bit further with the Dragon Kings of various river clans as she ate and drank alone. The banquet hall was bustling. All the plates that the servers brought out were authentic delicacies from various parts of the world. Jacob was positively charmed by the different cuisines served in front of him, some that he hadn't even heard of. Sophie sat beside Jacob and wasn't interested in the conversation going on at the table at all. She ate slowly and only replied to Jacob with one-word answers. Jacob figured that she was disturbed by the scene that went down just minutes prior, effectively dampening the mood of her birthday party. He decided to talk to her about it later, as he couldn't say much in front of so many people, all of whom had sharp hearing. He also ate his meal silently, as he knew that talking to Kenneth wasn't an option. After a while, the atmosphere became even more animated. Dracon touched Sophie's shoulder. "Today's your birthday. You can't just sit here. Go talk to all the seniors."
Okay.
Sophie sighed and stood up. She knew that it was her duty as the crown princess. She had to go and mingle with all the important people at the party. This was a way for her to build relationships with all these powerful elders from different clans that would help her in the future.
"Go with her, Jacob,"
Helen added.
Okay.
Jacob stood up and took his wine glass. They had to start from the most distant table. Sophie passed through the crowded hall and went to the table that was closest to the door. Jacob held his wine glass and walked beside her. They immediately became the focus of everyone's attention. Seeing everyone looking at them, Sophie went closer to Jacob. She hesitated for a bit and wrapped her hand around Jacob's arm. Under the spotlight, Sophie leaned toward Jacob lightly and slowly moved closer to him. She was showing everybody that Jacob was her prince consort. The most distant table was the Dragon Kings of the rivers near the North Atlantic. They saw Sophie walk over and stood up in a hurry. Dracon seemed like he was in his 30s or 40s, but he was actually more than 200 years old. Yet Sophie was actually 15 years old. It seemed like Dracon was strict towards Sophie, but he truly spoiled his daughter a lot. It was a fact that all the nearby Dragon Kings knew. Therefore, these river Dragon Kings didn't dare to give her an attitude and were polite when Sophie came to greet them. Going through one table after another, Sophie ended up making a toast with most of them. Though she wasn't afraid of getting drunk because she was drinking a non-alcoholic punch. However, Jacob felt slightly dizzy from all the drinking. The wine served today was 100 Flower wine, which was extracted and made from 100 Flower Palace's precious herbs. A mortal without cultivation could get drunk even with a small sip of this wine. Sophie held on to Jacob tightly, as she was afraid he would pass out. The last table other than the main table was the one where Grandmaster Hank sat. In fact, Sophie didn't want to go and greet them at all, but she had to walk over reluctantly under everyone's gaze. On the surface, South Atlantic and North Atlantic were still stable as allies, and it would be considered a big disrespect if the princess didn't greet them like the others.
"Grandmaster Hank, I hope you're having a good time here. I'm so glad that you could grace my birthday party with your presence."
Walking to the table, Sophie said the lines just like she had practiced many times. Grandmaster Hank snorted lightly. However, he couldn't just get mad for no reason when all the eyes in the building were on him. In fact, Dracon and Helen already made Jacob and Sophie go around the hall and greet all the guests together. It was just like announcing that Soph was taken and North Atlantic had its prince consort. If anyone wanted to have personal relations with North Atlantic, it would be pitiful because North Atlantic's little princess, Sophie, was already engaged. At this time, Jacob closely looked at the jealous gaze of the South Atlantic's crown prince, Henry. "Don't you worry. I'll talk to the North Atlantic thoroughly after the party's over." When Sophie and Jacob were about to leave, Grandmaster Hank said solemnly. Episode 174, The Perfect Couple. Sophie ignored Grandmaster Hank's last comment and dragged Jacob away from his table. Jacob felt the coldness from Grandmaster Hank's eyes when they turned around. When Jacob was an ordinary human, South Atlantic couldn't do anything to him because of the inspectors. However, he had broken through to the first level now, which meant that he was qualified to become a member of the Dragon Tribe and Sophie's fiancé. Since he was now a cultivator and no longer a mortal, it wasn't against the rules to fight against a cultivator. Sophie and Jacob went back to their table for a break. It was not easy to walk around and greet all the guests at their tables. "Look at you! You got all sweaty. Why don't you go touch up your makeup and get changed?" Helen was worried about Sophie.
Okay.
Sophie stood up. "I'll go with you." Jacob stood up as well. She turned around to him and nodded at his suggestion. They got out of the banquet hall and headed towards the dressing room through the corridor. A ray of white light flashed over and blocked their way. Henry, who was in his black and white polka dot shirt, appeared in front of them. Sophie's face turned cold immediately.
"Get out of the way."
"Soph, you should be marrying me. We are the right match." Instead of getting out of the way, he shouted out to her passionately.
"I'm not marrying you."
She was still cold.
"I will call for my uncle if you don't move."
Sophie's threat had its effect. Henry moved a few steps aside, since he knew how powerful her Uncle Kenneth was. Even his grandpa, who could defeat anyone in the South Atlantic, wouldn't be able to beat him here. However, he didn't give up and pointed at Jacob. "You are choosing him, a first-level dumbass, to be your future husband?"
"First level? You might not even be able to defeat him."
Sophie spat venomously, getting madder by the second. Henry remembered how Jacob defeated Tom when they first entered the lobby. He narrowed his eyes. Jacob looked at Henry, who he was meeting for the first time. He seemed to have gotten his arrogance from his grandfather. On top of that, the status of prince had made him even more overconfident. Henry stepped forward and said, "Soph, if you marry me, I will give you mountains of gold and silver. What does he have?"
"No one cares about your gold mountains. Get out of the way."
She gritted her teeth. Henry took out a coral which was shining with purple light. He said to her, "This is my gift to you, Soph, a purple coral that has been around for 10,000 years. He pointed at Jacob. "What did he give you?" Jacob was stupefied as he remembered that he forgot to get Sophie something for her birthday. Sophie was frozen for a moment as well, but she immediately took out her phone and pointed at its back cover.
"This is his gift to me."
Jacob remembered it was what he got her from the little shop outside of Sophie's school. He blushed a little out of embarrassment, as it was only worth about $5. Henry laughed out loud at her answer. "This? I can buy you millions or billions of them if you want."
"Who wants it from you? I only want this one he got me. Do you know why it's so special? Because he got it for me."
Sophie reached out her hand and knocked the purple coral in his hand over. Henry quickly reached out to catch it, but it still fell onto the floor. Although the coral was 10,000 years old, it was extremely fragile. It broke into pieces when it hit the floor. Not wanting to bother him any further, Sophie dragged Jacob to the dressing room not far from them. Jacob secretly smiled at her.
You know why it is so special? Because he got it for me.
Jacob was touched by her remark. It made him feel even more guilty for forgetting about her actual birthday present because of his tests. Henry slowly straightened up his body from trying to catch the purple coral. He saw them walk away, hand in hand, and realized that Sophie, who was promised to be his bride by his grandfather, would be someone else's girlfriend from now on. It made him mad. As the prince of the South Atlantic Dragon Palace, he could get any beautiful girl he wanted. However, Sophie wouldn't even let him touch her. As long as Sophie was married into the South Atlantic, it would be an actual unity by marriage between the North and the South Atlantic. If the princess of the North Atlantic lived in the South Atlantic, the resources and business of the North Atlantic would all automatically become those of the South Atlantic. Therefore, fulfilling his grandson's wish was pretty tempting to Grandmaster Hank, and was the reason he wanted him to marry Sophie. More importantly, it was out of consideration of their benefits. However, the North Atlantic had already found themselves a prince consort, which made it completely impossible for Sophie to marry into the South Atlantic. This had ruined their entire plan. Hence, Grandmaster Hank was so mad that he halted his 100 years of seclusion cultivation to come to Sophie's birthday party and put pressure on them. Sophie slammed the door after they got to the dressing room. The makeup artist, stylist, and hairdresser all came to her in a hurry.
What do you need, Miss Sophie? I want to get changed and have my makeup redone,
Sophie said. They didn't dare waste any time after seeing how bad of a mood she was in. They led her into another huge dressing room and prepared several dressers for her to choose from. A few minutes later, Sophie got out of the room in a black silk tank top and a colorful skirt. Jacob was a little starstruck when he saw her looking so charming in the outfit. With the excellent hairdresser and makeup artist, her face appeared to be prettier than before, and her tied-up hair made her look elegant. She had the aura of the royal princess she was. He could only wonder how beautiful she would be by the time she would take over the throne.
Prince, let us fix you up a little as well,
they walked to Jacob and said in excitement. Jacob had quite a bit of alcohol in him right now, and he was a little dizzy with a weird look on his face. He was pushed into the room and got changed into the clothes that they handed over to him. Then, he went to the dressing table and they adjusted his hair and covered the blush up with makeup. He was wearing the most formal outfit, a good quality black tuxedo with a white bow tie. He looked very dashing in the tuxedo and smiled when he found Sophie checking him out through the mirror. When Jacob and Sophie reappeared in the banquet hall hand in hand, their matching outfits astonished everyone once again. They looked like a celebrity couple, ready to walk on the red carpet. Sophie suddenly looked mature, and Jacob looked dignified and majestic. The bright light shot right in front of them as most of the guests started to applaud loudly. What a perfect match! A talented man and a beautiful woman. It made everyone jealous. The slight blush on Sophie's face made her even more pretty. Jacob coughed twice to calm himself down. It was the first time that he experienced something like this. However, with Sophie's arm around his arm, he had to keep his temperament and try not to make a fool of himself. The two of them went back to the main table under everyone's stare. Their faces were both red when they sat down. Helen covered her mouth to hide her satisfied smile, and Elder Frank in the corner of the hall gave Helen a big thumbs up. Obviously, it was all her plan.
It's so embarrassing, Mom.
Sophie sat down and complained. Even though she said that, her back straightened when she walked down the banquet hall with Jacob. She didn't want anyone to look down upon them. The same went for Jacob. Seeing everyone's eyes on him and Sophie, he put on a better show. Helen's arrangement was meant to emphasize their relationship and how perfect they looked together. At the South Atlantic table beside them, Henry's anger could be seen in his eyes, clear as day. The elders could still keep calm, as Grandmaster Hank held his words back in flames of fury. Since many representatives of many forces were present, he had to hold back. Causing problems during the party would be unwise. However, what North Atlantic just did was an act against South Atlantic in Grandmaster Hank's opinion. At the main table, Helen was almost enjoying how red Jacob and Sophie had gotten from all the attention. She moved over secretly and teasingly asked, "Is Jacob looking handsome today, Soph?" "Why are you like this, Mom?" Sophie whined a little, knowing that her mom was just teasing her. As the birthday girl today, everyone had to go along with her wishes. Helen took her question back and stopped teasing her. Sophie rolled her eyes at her mother's antics and turned to steal a secret glance at Jacob. He looked handsome indeed. Jacob kept smiling beside Sophie because people kept looking over at them. Many hermits and elders in the mountains came to the party not knowing that the Princess of North Atlantic already had a prince consort. Cheers and laughter lasted until the end of the party. Episode 175. Who should Sophie marry? Dracon and Helen were at the door to see everyone off as the guests left the restaurant one by one. The elders whom Helen picked up during the day all left by flying in the night. The city was crowded like a forest of steel. They had trouble finding this place, but it was a piece of cake for them to return to their places of seclusion. The people of South Atlantic Dragon Palace were the last to arrive, as well as the last to leave. Seeing that the couple had seen all the guests off, Grandmaster Hank and his people stood in the lobby, not ready to leave. "What? You don't want to leave after you've inhaled most of the food?" Kenneth stared at Grandmaster Hank from the lobby and said loudly. "Don't be rude, Kenneth." Dracon scolded him quietly. As long as it was still within the day, the South Atlantic clan was still their guest. "Dragon King, I think we still need to discuss some things." Grandmaster Hank stepped forward and said directly. Since all the guests had already left, Dracon thought for a bit and reached out his right hand. "Please." They left a few people guarding the entrance while Dracon, the elders, and some important figures of South Atlantic went upstairs into the meeting room on the 3rd floor. Helen took Jacob and Sophie along with them. Instead of sitting down at the long desk in the room, the two groups of people seated themselves in the greeting area of the room. Grandmaster Hank and Dracon each sat opposite each other in the middle, and the others either sat beside them or stood on the side. Beside Dracon seated Kenneth, then it was Helen, Sophie, and Jacob. All the elders of the North Atlantic were standing. On Grandmaster Hank's side, his grandson, Henry, was beside him while their elders were standing as well. "What do you have in mind to discuss, Grandmaster Hank?" Dracon picked up a cup of green tea after he had sat down. "I'll be up front with you, Dragon King. You knew that, as per the Dragon Tribe's tradition, the royal heirs have to be betrothed by the time they are 15. You also knew that we would be proposing the marriage of your Sophie to our Henry, yet you still put on this show. What is it that you are trying to pull?" Grandmaster Hank threw a question at Dracon without even touching the cup of tea in front of him. "I'm not sure what you are talking about." Dracon took another sip and said calmly, "Don't play dumb with me. We had informed your clan 2 years ago that we will hold a magnificent wedding for Sophie. We would have the engagement ceremony when she turns 15 and the marriage when she turns 18, Grandmaster Hank said, clenching his fists. You old idiot. Who are you to say that she will marry into South Atlantic? When did Soph ever agree? Kenneth shouted abruptly. Grandmaster Hank smashed his palm into the rosewood tea table, leaving a deep palm print. What are you trying to do by secretly setting up a marriage? He shouted. Kenneth smashed his palm on the table as well, and the tea table turned into pieces immediately. Since when did you have a say in what we decide to do in our clan? Kenneth roared. The atmosphere suddenly got intense, and both sides were on the edge of starting a fight. Although North Atlantic had a master like Kenneth, the average strength of the people on South Atlantic's side was higher than that of North Atlantic's. Grandmaster Hank took a few deep breaths and said coldly, You would be facing a war if you don't give us an answer. A war? War in the world of cultivation. Not only the elders of North Atlantic, but also the elders of South Atlantic shivered. There hadn't been a large war in the cultivation world for over 600 years. Due to the ascendance of the human cultivators and the establishment of Dragon Tribe's inspector system, there hadn't even been a single kill in almost 100 years. Both North and South Atlantic dragon clans were of great power, so the inspectors wouldn't be able to stop a war between the two. 6 sects of the human cultivators were involved in the war 600 years ago, and all sides lost half of their masters and elites as a result. Although the Dragon Tribe wasn't officially involved in the war, it was still affected and lost 16 8th-level masters. Grandmaster Hank's remark implied how serious he was. It would cause huge consequences if this matter around Sophie caused a war between the dragon clans. Dracon stopped Kenneth, who wanted to speak, and kept calm as he asked Grandmaster Hank, What do you want? Cancel the marriage between Sophie and this kid and let her marry Henry after 3 years, Grandmaster Hank said firmly. His stern attitude showed how certain he was about this. It also demonstrated how Sophie would be treated if she were to marry into the South Atlantic. Hearing this, Sophie was so mad that she tried to stand up and say something, but Helen stopped her. Dracon knew that Hank wanted to take advantage of his clan, and he would find just any excuse to do so. It was true that Henry was fond of Sophie, but he was rude and unreasonable, not to mention that he was a womanizer and a bully who had no good characteristics at all. How could Dracon let his little girl marry such a menace of a prince? Dracon didn't want to give in, so he put the teacup on the table as he said lightly, That is impossible. You. A strong power raised from Grandmaster Hank's body. He had always thought Dracon was a pushover and had no idea that he would be so firm on the issue involving his daughter. But he didn't dare to announce the war. Both North Atlantic and South Atlantic had thousands of years of history, and a war wouldn't do South Atlantic any good, even if they won. Although it seemed like the other oceans weren't doing anything, they were both monitoring the relationship between these two clans. Grandmaster Hank's body slightly trembled as he said, All right, I will give you another month to decide. That won't be necessary because Soph has found her future husband and we respect her decision. So we won't consider marrying her with Henry against her wish, Dracon said lightly. Hearing this, Sophie looked at Jacob on her side and blushed. Even though she hadn't really chosen Jacob to be her husband, she knew that he would make 1,000 times better husband than Henry any day. Jacob, on the other hand, was listening to the discussion quietly and analyzing the situation, as always. He now understood why he was made into the Prince Consort so easily. He was the key to cutting off South Atlantic. Otherwise, it would have been hard for Dracon to reject the marriage proposal due to the relationship between the two clans. But now, since Sophie had chosen the Prince Consort herself, and the Prince Consort had successfully become a member of the clan, it would be arbitrary for South Atlantic to argue on that. If Sophie weren't taken and North Atlantic rejected South Atlantic's proposal, North Atlantic would be to blame for embarrassing Henry and even Hank. However, since Sophie is already taken, if Henry wishes to marry her forcefully now, the South Atlantic is to be blamed for interfering with other people's relationships. No matter what, North Atlantic was standing on the winning side right now. If South Atlantic were to start a war on purpose, most neutral forces would be on North Atlantic's side. Jacob had reached the first level before Sophie's birthday party. It might not seem like a huge deal, but it was a significant contribution strategically. Good. Grandmaster Hank stared at Dracon and said. He understood that, although they were more powerful, the other clan was better than them strategically. Also, North Atlantic's land business was more prosperous than theirs, and they were more successful in drawing other powers over to their side. North Atlantic had been planning on this ever since a few months ago, and Sophie's birthday party was only a demonstration of their capabilities. Dracon had secretly prepared for a war a long time ago. They would be falling into North Atlantic's trap if South Atlantic announced a war right now. Goodbye. Grandmaster Hank suddenly stood up and walked out of the room. Episode 176. Let's go meet Grandma. Seeing Grandmaster Hank leave with all the elders of South Atlantic, Dracon picked up his teacup again and took a sip. The confrontation wasn't easy for him either. He placed the cup back on the table, and the table broke into pieces all of a sudden. The cup fell onto the floor and shattered as well. Then, the chair Grandmaster Hank was sitting on before disassembled on its own, too. Grandmaster Hank's heaven-quaking scroll has already reached the top level, and anyone under the mid-tier 8th level would be severely injured or killed by his attack. Kenneth stood up and said. Dracon stood up as well and asked Kenneth as he looked at the pieces on the floor, Were you harmed by his attack? No, I'm not harmed. I'm on a higher level than he is, and my technique is stronger than his. It's not a problem. The old guy looks terrifying, but he's just a coward in reality. He tried his best to avoid breaking through the mid-tier 8th level just to dodge the heavenly tribulation. Dracon nodded and turned to Jacob and Sophie without saying anything else. Come on, let's go home. He then turned to the elders and said, You all had a long day today. Go back and take some rest. General Arthur, let me take a look at the list of gifts after you are done writing it. As you wish, my king. General Arthur bowed. Dracon left the meeting room. Helen, Jacob, and Sophie followed him out. All the elders bowed to them together and said, Goodbye, Dragon King. Helen asked Jacob to leave his car in the garage here, and the four of them went back to Sophie's house in Dracon's car. Helen was worried that the people of the South Atlantic were still around to cause Jacob trouble. She asked him to stay the night so that they could protect him. Don't worry, Helen. They won't dare to do anything to Jacob. The situation right now is that Jacob is the prince consort of our clan, and we will fight back with full strength if they do anything to him. Grandmaster Hank knows the consequences, Dracon said as he took off his jacket. He was a bit tired from entertaining all the guests today. It's better to be careful no matter what. Jacob should stay the night, Helen insisted. Jacob nodded and decided to stay to keep Sophie company. Since his grandma and parents were not home, it would be boring to go back and stay there by himself. I'm going upstairs then. Sophie rubbed her eyes, looking sleepy. Secretly, she was also relieved when her mom asked Jacob to stay. He would be safer in their home. Jacob silently followed her upstairs. As soon as she went back to her room, Sophie went to the bathroom for a shower after having such a long day. Unlike Jacob, she took a day off from school and had been welcoming the important guests since this morning. Now it was already 10 in the night, so she was more than ready to pass out on her bed. Jacob just sat at her study table and started flipping through her books to keep his mind away from the events of the day, especially the very clear war threat that had been issued because of him. The sweet scent in the room was one Jacob was now very familiar with, and it made him feel warm and comfortable. By the time Sophie walked out of the bathroom in her PJs, Jacob was positively zoned out.
"Hey, you didn't give me a birthday gift this time."
She dried her hair with a little towel as she walked over.
"I just came back from my grandma's and went straight to school to get my result. I'm really sorry. It slipped my mind among all the chaos,"
Jacob answered apologetically.
"I can't believe that you forgot my birthday gift."
She rolled her eyes playfully. Sophie didn't really care much for a gift. Sure, she had expected one, but she wasn't too disappointed at the lack of it. She had started this conversation in the hopes that it would distract Jacob from the disturbing thoughts of the other clan.
"I'll make it up,"
Jacob said softly.
"Since my birthday's already over, there isn't much making up that you can do."
She reached out her palm and said confidently,
"Hand over your wallet."
Jacob was like a helpless lamb in front of her. He took out his wallet obediently and put it in her hand. Sophie opened the wallet without hesitation and took the big notes out of it. She counted the money carefully, putting some of it back in the wallet, and said, with her head lifted,
"I'll let this one slide. Since there was no gift, I'll take the cash."
She was one bossy girl for sure. Jacob smiled at her antics as she stuffed the money in her side drawer and handed him his wallet back. She would definitely make a cute mugger, one to whom people would hand their money willingly.
"All right, go take a shower."
Seeing Jacob staring at her, she blushed and tried to get him moving again. Jacob walked into the bathroom.
"Here."
She flipped out a set of men's pajamas from her nightstand drawer and threw it at Jacob. He caught it and looked at her. Sophie realized that something was wrong and blushed immediately.
It's my mom who put it here."
Jacob laughed and took the pajamas into the bathroom. Sophie, on the other hand, flushed as she realized that her explanation was a bit far-fetched. After a nice, relaxing cold shower, Jacob walked out of the bathroom and saw Sophie on her computer, playing a video game. Jacob went over. "I'll put my clothes here for now."
"Leave it, and my mom will take them when she comes to take the laundry basket,"
Sophie said. Her eyes were still fixated on the computer screen. "Let's go to bed. It's late already," Jacob said. Only after he had said it out loud did Jacob realize how wrong that must have sounded. Sure enough, Sophie turned to look at him with a start.
What?"
"I mean, you should go to bed," Jacob explained immediately, his face going completely red.
"There's no school tomorrow,"
Sophie murmured and kept on playing her game.
"Damn it,"
she added. Jacob was surprised by her sudden reaction. Then, he realized that she had just lost another game.
"Hey."
She turned to Jacob and said,
"Aren't you good at games? Come and help me."
Jacob was speechless. "I'll help you win 2 rounds, and then you go to bed. Deal?" he asked.
10 rounds, till he exits the game himself,"
Sophie shouted. It seemed like she was furious at her opponent. "Go to sleep soon, guys." Helen knocked on the door.
I know, Mom. It's my birthday,"
Sophie yelled. Helen shook her head, laughed a little, and left. This daughter of hers was too much to keep in line. She had decided to let Jacob deal with Sophie in the future. Jacob sat in the sofa chair in front of the computer. Sophie was too lazy to pull out the other chair, so she just sat on the armrest of the chair. Jacob put his hands on the keyboard, took a deep breath, and waited for the game to start. This was one of the games that he was really good at when he was in high school. However, he hadn't played since he started university. Jacob quickly hit the keyboard as soon as the game started. The opponent was skillful, for sure. The game took a long time, and Jacob almost got a cramp in his wrist. At last, his experience didn't disappoint him, and he won the game. He turned back and found Sophie leaning on his back in excitement. She stared at the screen with a cheerful smile on her face. He gave her a victorious smile as she muttered some curses at the opponent and said something that sounded a lot like, "Take that, Bloodmaster 007. What are you looking at? Go ahead and start the second game," she shouted out excitedly. "What do I get if I win?" Jacob asked on purpose. "Whatever you want. Just help me destroy him first," Sophie said absent-mindedly. Her entire focus was on the screen, and she didn't even notice what she had just said. Jacob shook his head lightly and started the second game. Here, and over there. Use the rifle." Her skills at instructing were obviously better than her gaming skills. She started to shout as the game got intense. Helen and Dracon could hear her in their room. They glimpsed at each other speechlessly and turned the volume of the TV up. In the end, Sophie couldn't help but reach out her arms to help Jacob with the tools. Her body shook slightly as she pressed onto the keyboard. Jacob felt the sudden change in the air in front of him. His hands were controlling the keyboard, and that made his arms wrap around her perfectly. Although the opponent was pretty good, there was no way that he or she could defeat the two of them. Soon, the opponent exited his gaming room after losing 6 games in a row. "Yes!" Sophie laughed loudly. However, she stopped immediately when she thought about how her mom would tell her that this wasn't very ladylike. But then she shrugged and laughed like that anyway. She looked at her sides and saw that Jacob's arms were wrapping her. It seemed like she was cuddling in his arms. That is what seized her laughter immediately. Her face felt like it was on fire as she backed away from the embrace. They had gotten fairly close now in terms of communication and comfort level, but physical closeness is still something both of them struggled with. Sophie calmed her racing heart down, thought for a bit, and hopped into her bed. Jacob sighed at the sudden shift in the atmosphere, but didn't dare comment on it. He took the blanket and pillow from Sophie's wardrobe, where he had left them the last time, and made his makeshift bed on the floor as always. They both lay there in silence for a few minutes before Jacob broke it. "That South Atlantic's prince," Jacob laid down and tried to ask. "I don't want to talk about him." Sophie cut him off immediately. Jacob zipped his lips as Sophie suddenly rolled over and asked him, "Grandma's on a trip?" "Yeah," Jacob nodded. "Let's go see her tomorrow." She blinked her eyes. All right." Jacob hesitated before agreeing. He knew that she was just avoiding the topic of the prince who troubled her, but couldn't bring himself to say anything about it. Episode 177. Anticipation of War. Sophie was probably really exhausted. She fell asleep within a few minutes. The room's lights were off, except for Sophie's bedside lamp. Jacob curled up in the dark and looked at the ceiling, finally letting himself think about what had happened during the day. The South Atlantic must have a strong background to back up its attitude. Grandmaster Hank, especially, was so arrogant. If it weren't for Sophie's third uncle, he would probably have kidnapped Sophie forcefully, even though they were on the enemy's turf. There were other things besides the issue with the North Atlantic and South Atlantic that were giving Jacob a headache. The room was tranquil, and Jacob could see some dim lights from the few corners of the room. Those were the array formations that Dracon and Helen put up when Sophie and Jacob slept over at Liam's place. Jacob looked at Sophie, who was already deep in her sleep, and sighed. All the stress made him think that maybe it would be easier just to be a mortal being. Before he knew it, it was the next morning already, and Jacob didn't sleep at all. He silently cultivated the Sword Shadow Scroll and guarded Sophie at the same time. He was feeling uneasy about the North Atlantic irritating the South Atlantic yesterday. Although he was only on the first level, he was still stronger than Sophie, who had lost all her power with her Dragon Core. That was when Sophie yawned as she stretched in her bed. She noticed that Jacob was staring at her, so she gave him a little sleepy smile. Jacob tried to smile back at her, but it turned out more like a grimace from the lack of sleep. Sophie didn't know that Jacob was awake all night. She hopped into the bathroom to freshen up. She was never concerned about the blatant threat.
What on earth could they do? We are not afraid of them at all,
she thought. Her confidence came from the assurance that her parents, and the whole clan, really would do anything to protect her. Jacob, too. She hadn't really seen the bad side of the dragon world, as she had grown up living like a mortal for the most part, and only heard occasional stories of the older battles. But she didn't believe that an actual battle would take place in today's times. The inspectors would handle it, surely. When they got downstairs, Helen had already prepared breakfast for them. Everything was nice and in order as usual.
I'm going to see Grandma with Jacob today, Mom.
Sophie took a bite of her bread. How are you going there? Helen asked.
Driving over.
Sophie pointed at Jacob.
He drove there last time, too.
Jacob nodded and said, You both should also come with us. We can't. There are a lot of things to deal with after the birthday party, Dracon said.
Then the two of us can go?
Sophie asked Dracon with a hopeful smile. Yeah, you guys can go. Dracon nodded casually. Sophie was delighted, but Jacob was surprised by the fact that Dracon allowed this. Be careful, Helen said to them and went upstairs to help Sophie pack some clothes. Then, Jacob took Dracon's car, as his car was still at the restaurant parking lot, and drove Sophie toward the little village where Grandma was at. As soon as Sophie and Jacob stepped out of the house, Dracon returned to his study room and said, General Arthur, go ahead.
Yes, Dragon King.
General Arthur walked out of the study room in his green robe and said,
According to the new information, amongst the elders who used the Mystic Ice, 6 of them have leveled up to 7th level.
6. Dracon looked down slightly, as if he was weighing the meaning of that number. South Atlantic has higher strength than us to start with, and now they have 6 more 7th level masters. No wonder they had the guts to cause trouble at the birthday party, Helen said. Dracon nodded with a serious look on his face. Keep going.
Yes.
General Arthur's look was serious as well.
There is also a report of the appearance of a soul formation cultivator in our city.
Soul formation cultivator? Dracon, who had always kept his calm, looked surprised.
Since it involves a soul formation cultivator, we weren't able to dig too deep. However, according to Susan's remarks during the birthday party and our comprehensive analysis, the reason for Tom Lester's transfer was that he had probably pissed this cultivator off.
Dracon frowned as he rubbed his chin. In that case, it does sound like that's what had happened. Tom Lester belongs to the Metal Elemental Dragon Clan, and he must have a special status in the Inspector system. He must have gotten on the bad side of an important person to be sent to the cold and remote mountains.
Also,
General Arthur hesitated for a few seconds before saying, "When Prince Jacob was breaking through to the first level, a soul formation cultivator who was passing by gave him some help." "Oh?" Helen and Dracon were both surprised this time. The general continued, "The entire situation appears to be more complex than we had estimated. The South Atlantic brought a lot of powerful cultivators this time, but they didn't do anything at the birthday party. They might be afraid of this soul formation cultivator in our city." Helen shook her head and said, "The soul formation cultivators do not interfere with issues within the dragon tribe. Even if the war between the two clans starts, they won't get involved as long as no human is injured. However, the transfer of Tom Lester was surely a reason for the South Atlantic to be on alert." "You are right, Queen. All three parties are in a stalemate for now, and we need to wait and see if Elder Kenneth can break through to the Heavenly Dragon Realm. Grandmaster Hank is not easy to deal with, and he must be waiting for his opportunity as well," General Arthur said. "You are right. He seemed like he lost his temper yesterday, but it was just an act. He is extremely sneaky. However, both sides are holding grudges about yesterday. I'm sure that there will be some conflicts in these few days. It's a good thing that Soph is not here for now." Dracon looked at General Arthur and said, "Don't worry about us. Just go ahead and secretly protect Jacob and Soph for the next 2 days." "As you say, King." General Arthur bowed, turned into a dash of green light, and disappeared. Jacob, in the meantime, was driving on the highway. Sophie was a bit nervous, since this was the first time that she and Jacob went on a trip by themselves. However, she was just happy that they could take this opportunity to avoid all of their problems back home. "What's wrong?" Having sensed her nervousness, Jacob asked. "Nothing really," she answered quickly, and then immediately changed the topic. "Why do you look so tired?" "Couldn't sleep last night," Jacob answered short, not telling her that he was worried about her safety, so stayed up to guard her. Sophie just nodded in understanding, but she didn't know what to say. "The place we are going to has quite poor amenities, so it might take a bit of time to get used to it," Jacob told her again as soon as they got past the halfway mark. "I know. You've said this about 5 times now. I'll manage." She frowned at him because she didn't think of herself as spoiled at all. Jacob drove for a while before he finally asked, "What's that South Atlantic prince's name?" "Told you not to speak of him." Sophie was not happy, but she still answered, "Henry." Jacob secretly memorized the name. He knew that this guy wasn't a good one. "Were you supposed to get married to him or something?" Jacob asked. "No, we never agreed. They were the ones who came up with it on their own, and my dad never agreed to it," she said. Jacob could imagine that the South Atlantic must have proposed a few times, and Dracon rejected using the excuse of Sophie's age. However, then they suddenly found Sophie a fiancé without telling her, and it made the South Atlantic clan furious. "This is probably why Dracon fought against all the pressure and made me, a human, into Sophie's prince consort," Jacob thought. There was silence in the car after that, as both of them sat there lost in their thoughts, and Sophie slowly fell asleep. Jacob tried his best to drive as smoothly as possible, so as not to disturb her. Sometimes he felt sorry for her, because although everyone catered to her needs as the princess, she didn't have much freedom. Normal teenagers her age partied every weekend and dated different people, and here she was, next to her fiancé, visiting his grandmother. Dracon and Helen probably decided to let her grow up on land to give her as normal a life as a Dragon Clan's future ruler could have. The 3-hour drive took them to the village. The bumpy road woke Sophie up from her dream, and she rubbed her eyes and looked outside. The picturesque houses surprised her.
Is this it?
She grew up in the city and would see luxurious palaces if she went to the Dragon Palace, but she had never seen these simple-looking houses surrounded by lots of greenery. Jacob simply nodded at her and watched her face light up with a smile. The vehicle drove into the yard, and Grandma, who was sitting there with her friend, saw Jacob and Sophie getting out of the black car. She walked over, surprised. "How come you are here?"
"Grandma!"
Sophie ran over to her and greeted her in her sweet voice.
"Oh, how come you didn't tell me that you have such a pretty granddaughter?"
That old lady, Grandma's friend, smiled as she also walked over to the new guests.
"Hello, it's really nice to meet you. You have a lovely home."
Sophie greeted her politely. "Such a pretty girl." The old lady smiled at Sophie and said, "This is not my granddaughter. She is my—" Grandma was about to explain. Sophie blushed as she called out,
"Grandma!"
Grandma changed up what she was about to say. "Our Soph is a little shy." The old lady didn't think much. She rubbed her head and said, "Today is Saturday, and all my sons who work in the towns nearby are back. There's only one empty room, and we don't have enough blankets." Episode 178. Baked Yams. Jacob and Sophie wanted to surprise Grandma, so they didn't notify her beforehand. Now, they were faced with an awkward situation that was beyond their expectations. There was only one room, and there was only one bed and one set of blankets. Sure, they had shared a room before, but the people here were total strangers to them and did not know about their situation. "We'll deal with the accommodation situation later tonight," Jacob said. He already had a plan for this one-room situation.
"If you need to be in separate rooms, I'll ask one of my sons to go back to town so that we can have another empty room,"
the old lady said. "That's not necessary. We'll deal with it later tonight." Jacob quickly rejected her suggestion. He didn't want to cause them so much trouble. Sophie quietly turned to Jacob as she was worried, but she didn't say anything.
"Now that you are here, let's have lunch first."
Grandma held Sophie's hand and said with a bright smile. After the 3-hour drive, they were just in time for lunch, which they were glad about. The whole family sat around their huge dining table and ate together. This came as a pleasant surprise to Sophie, because at home it was mostly just the three of them and sometimes Jacob. She laughed and talked to everyone present. Jacob's grandma was also very happy in her presence. The old lady's family had an orchard of their own, so they decided to spend some time there. They all went there after lunch to pick apples for dessert later that night. Jacob's grandma enjoyed the company of her friend and had taken a liking to her countryside lifestyle over the past few days. Sophie found it fun, so she went to help, barefooted. She got exhausted after just picking less than a dozen apples, while Jacob picked about 20. Grandma smiled when she saw that they were having lots of fun on the other side of the orchard, being playful and helping each other. They worked there until 3 in the afternoon, and everyone took a break. Sophie lost interest in it after a while and ran back towards the shade as the sunlight got too much. Then, she picked a random spot to sit from where she watched the others at work. The old lady, who was taking a break on the side, nudged Jacob's grandma with her elbow.
That is not your grandson's girlfriend, is it?"
Grandma didn't reply to her friend and just smiled suspiciously as she narrowed her eyes.
"In the afternoon, let's do something else."
Sophie walked to Jacob on the warm cobblestones and said, "Are you bored already?" Jacob said absent-mindedly as he wiped his dirty hands over his jeans.
"Not really. I'm here to see Grandma. But yeah, this place doesn't really have much to do."
Sophie shrugged. Jacob looked at her and replied, "All right, we'll We'll go roam around the place in the afternoon."
Yes, yes.
Sophie put on her shoes and cheered. Jacob and Sophie escaped, in Grandma's words, from the orchard after telling her. They went into the village and wandered around. The whole village seemed to have come right out of a painting. The air was much cleaner than in the city. The courtyards were big, and most houses had a well-maintained garden. Suddenly, a chained-up black dog barked at Sophie when she passed by. She got scared and immediately jumped to hide behind Jacob. Jacob laughed at her reaction and teased her. "Hey, you're a dragon and you're scared of a puppy?" Sophie hit his back as hard as she could in response and walked ahead as if nothing had happened. When they passed by a giant warehouse, Sophie was curious about what was inside. She got on her tiptoes to look through the window. When she saw yams piled up in little hills inside, she was excited.
"Hey, there are yams inside."
Her eyes brightened as if she hadn't eaten in hundreds of years. Jacob sighed lightly as he walked over to her and looked inside as well.
"So what?" "Baked yams."
Her eyes shot out lights of excitement. Before Jacob could protest, he was dragged to the front of the warehouse by his arm. To their surprise, the iron gate was not locked at all. They lightly pushed it open and entered. Sophie was extremely excited to see hills of yams right in front of her. Regardless of the dirt on them, she dashed over like a greedy thief and stuffed 2 into her pocket and a few more in her arms. Seeing Jacob not moving, she called out,
"What are you doing? Come, let's take some."
Jacob put 4 or 5 in his arms reluctantly. He had never stolen anything, let alone something as small as yams that they could get in the supermarket back home. But, seeing the excitement shining in Sophie's eyes, he decided to go along with this little harmless shenanigan of hers. Sophie couldn't take any more, despite how much she wanted to. She got out of the warehouse reluctantly. Just when they stepped out, a few people, who looked like farmers, passed by and saw them sneaking out. They shouted out, "What are you doing?" Sophie ran away out of panic, and Jacob followed her without thinking. The 2 of them hastily dashed onto the little road as the yams rolled out of their arms. General Arthur, who was looking down on them from a low cloud, started sweating profusely.
"The Princess of North Atlantic Dragon Clan is stealing yams with her fiancé,"
he thought nervously. Sophie and Jacob ran out of the village and were relieved when they found that there was no one after them. They counted the stolen goods and realized that most of them were gone. Jacob only had a couple in his arms, while Sophie had 2 in her pockets. Altogether, they had 5. Sophie carried the yams happily as if they were priceless treasures. Jacob realized that it was her first time experiencing country life, and that was the reason every little insignificant thing also excited her. Jacob knew that these yams weren't worth much and didn't yield a good price in the market. The farmers wouldn't even care if Jacob and Sophie asked them for a dozen, and that was why the warehouse wasn't locked. Jacob only ran away with Sophie because he found it funny seeing how thrilled she was at the little heist they had pulled.
"Let's bake them here."
Sophie calmed herself down a little and suggested. She was satisfied with the surroundings. They were just outside the village and surrounded by a few little hills, which were perfect for blocking the wind. Jacob picked up some tree branches and created a little hole with his 5 elemental sword energies. He put a single yam inside and covered it with the branches. Then, he lit it up with the fire elemental sword energy. He was only at the 1st level and had only mastered the 1st level of the Sword Shadow Scroll. The 5 elemental sword energies wouldn't be able to harm an enemy. In terms of offensive power, they might not even be better than kitchen knives. However, they worked pretty well at trivial things like this. Sophie carried a stone over to sit beside the fire. She stared at the fire full of expectation.
"Can it be cooked properly?"
she asked. It was obvious that this was the first time she was baking yams. Jacob found himself a stone to sit on as well and said, Of course. I've done it a lot when I was little.
Shouldn't we be putting it on top of the fire? Can it be cooked underneath?
Sophie was still questioning his words. That would burn it. It wouldn't be baking unless it's underneath, Jacob explained to her patiently. He was amused seeing how she had no interest in the 5 elemental sword energies he just used, but she was so curious about baking yams. About 20 minutes later, Jacob released some water elemental sword energies to extinguish the flame. He removed the ash and took out a black yam from underneath. Sophie didn't care about the cleanliness and reached over to grab it. As soon as she had it in her hands, she realized how hot a freshly baked yam was. She immediately started to blow on it and juggle it a bit as she couldn't hold it. Even so, she didn't want to let go of it. She switched it between her hands and revealed her greediness. When it cooled down a little, she couldn't wait to peel it open. The tempting golden color of the inside demonstrated how well done it was. Sophie was probably afraid of Jacob stealing it from her, so she bit onto it with both hands holding it. However, the inner part was still a bit hot. She started to blow again as soon as she took a bite. Jacob wanted to laugh at her antics. She looked like she was eating some exotic gourmet dish. He looked at her for a bit as she struggled with the food in her hand. 1 yam was not enough for her, though. She pointed at Jacob as she ate.
Bake another one! Bake another one!
Jacob shook his head with a smile. He gathered more tree branches and put 2 yams in the hole, which was still warm. He kept adding branches into the flame to keep up the temperature. Sophie rubbed her belly in satisfaction after she had finished that yam. She patted Jacob's shoulder with her dirty hands.
Let me do it! Let me do it!
After watching Jacob, she thought that baking yam was a piece of cake, so she decided to try it herself. After adding branches to the flame for 20 minutes, Sophie asked Jacob to extinguish the fire. He hastily took out the 2 yams from the ashes, only to find that they were already burned into coal-like black pieces. Jacob looked at Sophie, and she instantly blushed. She didn't think that the inside would be burned as bad as the outside. After peeling off the burned layers, there were still some edible parts inside.
Here, this one's for you.
She passed one to Jacob with a sweet smile. She was eating happily, despite the black stains on her hands. Jacob smiled as he realized that Sophie was just enjoying herself, despite the failure she just had. It was endearing to watch her have a good time with him, just sitting there picking out the edible parts.
Pay attention to your cultivation. Although having fun is important, cultivation is more important. It would be troublesome if you can't defeat Henry in the future.
Sophie patted Jacob's shoulder and said, out of nowhere, Episode 179, Natal Treasures. After eating the baked yams, Sophie was full. She placed the 2 remaining ones on the roadside for the lucky person who would walk by. It was already about 5 in the evening when Jacob and Sophie turned around to go back. Now, with her belly full, Sophie was energetic again, looking around interestedly. That Henry, what level is he on now? Halfway across the village, Jacob asked Sophie.
I suppose he reached 3rd level about a year or half a year ago,
Sophie said distractedly. 3rd level. Jacob thought about it. It was equivalent to the 3rd realm for human cultivators. Although Henry was only 2 levels higher than him, there was a drastic difference between them. With the aid of the Dragon Core, it was quite easy for the dragons to reach the 3rd level. However, before a dragon could reach the 3rd level, his or her level would still be in the 2nd realm. There was a huge difference between the 2 realms.
Third level is nothing special. I was once at third level,
Sophie said, as if trying to reassure Jacob after seeing his hesitation. Jacob knew Sophie's third level was the result of elixirs. Judging from how protected and spoiled she was, it was hard to imagine Sophie's parents letting her do all that hard work. In contrast, as the crown prince, whose grandfather was a top-tier master, Henry must have reached third level on his own, since he had to inherit the South Atlantic Dragon clan in the future. The cultivator of the first level could never defeat a cultivator of the third level, right? Jacob asked her.
No, I don't think so.
Sophie turned to look at Jacob.
I think Henry is quite powerful. Grandmaster Hank taught him a blue-grade technique which I think is called 3 Stars Destruction Scroll.
It seems that Henry indeed meant to marry her, since he even told her his cultivation technique. Of course, he must have been trying to show off when he told her that, Jacob thought.
It is said that this technique would allow the cultivator to have 3 powerful natal treasures. However, he only has 1 natal treasure now, and I don't even know what kind of treasure it is.
Sophie told Jacob everything she knew about Henry. She wanted to help him prepare as much as she could. She didn't want to see Jacob lose to Henry. She was worried that Henry would ambush Jacob and challenge him while his cultivation level was still relatively low. Then, she thought about Jacob's fight with Tom Lester and admitted that it was quite a triumph. If she had to choose between Henry and Jacob, she would undoubtedly pick Jacob. She had heard a lot of unsavory tales about Henry, and she wondered how many more incidents she didn't know about. When Sophie visited the Dragon Palace as a little girl, she just played pranks on the ordinary soldiers but never hurt them. However, Henry had wounded and even crippled some South Atlantic soldiers, and that was why the people in and out of the South Atlantic Dragon Palace would flee at the sight of Henry. After all, he was the crown prince who was spoiled by his grandfather, who was mostly in seclusion cultivation, and had not left the Dragon Palace for hundreds of years. While they chatted, they walked toward that old lady's courtyard. As they turned towards each other to conclude their conversation, Jacob noticed black stains on both corners of Sophie's lips. He pulled her arm and said, "Wait a moment, there are some black stains around your lips."
Black stains?
Yeah, you must have got them when you ate the yams. Jacob pointed at the corners of her lips. Sophie tried to look down but couldn't see. She tried to rub them off with her fingers but couldn't do it properly without a mirror. Jacob turned to face her and brushed her hand off. He put his fingers in the clear water inside a container by the roadside and lightly rubbed at the black stains at the corners of her lips. It was a little hard to clean the stain since it was ash, but Jacob was patient with his task. He carefully tried to clean as much of the ash as he could, while trying not to focus too much on how close they were standing. Sophie also stood frozen, as if taking one step would make her explode. She felt her heart beating faster, and her face reddened as Jacob stared at her so intensely. Exhaling deeply, Jacob finally got her lips clean. He took a small step back to get out of Sophie's personal space, but neither of them made a move to go inside. They stood there and stared at each other when an old man led an ox over and shut it in a fenced shed beside them. Then, this ox began to drink the water from the container beside them. Sophie and Jacob exchanged a surprised look and realized immediately that the water Jacob used to clean Sophie's face was in fact the drinking water for the ox.
"You're dead!"
With a gasp, Sophie raised her hand to hit Jacob. Laughing, Jacob ran away immediately. Sophie chased him into the old lady's courtyard. Seeing them running back, Grandma chuckled. After eating 2 yams, Sophie was so full that she didn't have a great appetite for dinner.
"Jacob, Soph, I'm afraid that you have to share one room tonight."
While eating, Grandma's friend glanced at them and said. Sophie looked at him as Jacob answered immediately, "No problem." Sophie was a little nervous as, when looking around the house, they had seen the room they were supposed to share. The room didn't have enough space for sleeping on the floor, and the bed was smaller than what she had back home. Jacob held her hands under the table, signaling her to be silent. Sophie had no idea what Jacob had in mind, but she trusted him enough to go along with it. After dinner, they enjoyed the cool air in the courtyard. The old lady's sons made small talk with Jacob about the city, the kids played in the courtyard, and Sophie happily chatted with Grandma. When the moon hid its face in the clouds, everyone called it a night. Jacob and Sophie entered a simple room in which there was only a bed and one set of bedding. Sophie looked at Jacob, thinking about how they were going to share such a small space. However, Jacob patted her on the arm and gestured her to keep silent before whispering,
"I'll sleep in the car outside, and you can sleep here. These guys only come home on the weekends, so we shouldn't make them go back to the town by taking their rooms."
Sophie just looked at him and nodded. With a smile on his face, Jacob silently opened the door. He crossed the courtyard and got into the car. Dracon's car was quite spacious, especially the back seats. It managed to accommodate one sleeping person in it with his legs bent. However, it was not as comfortable as a solid bed. Jacob turned around again and again and couldn't find a comfortable position. Finally, he sat up cross-legged and began to cultivate the Sword Shadow Scroll. 5 sword energies slowly circulated in his body while Jacob controlled their strength with the technique. The sword energies sometimes traveled out of his body and sometimes entered his body. When the 5 sword energies combined, they formed small gray sword energy. The sword energy pulsated in his palm as if he was alive. Natal treasure. Suddenly, Jacob remembered the things that Sophie had told him during the day. Henry could have 3 natal treasures which could be connected to the owner's mind. The cultivator could control them at will and could utilize their full power. On top of that, as the cultivator reached a higher realm, his or her natal treasure would also elevate and grow more powerful. My sword energies are formed by the essence in my body, and they share my blood and mind. Are they natal treasures? The technique Henry is cultivating can let him have 3 natal treasures. With 2 more natal treasures than most cultivators, he's naturally more powerful. Well, this chaotic sword energy of mine could be divided into 5 elemental swords. Does it mean that I have 5 natal treasures? If I could achieve the realm of 10,000 swords at heart, mentioned in the Sword Shadow Scroll, and could transform the sword energy into tens of thousands of swords, does it mean that I will have tens of thousands of natal treasures at my command? At this thought, Jacob turned his attention from the control of the strength of the sword energy to the control of its direction. The sword energy ran through his body and clothes with faint muffled thunder sounds. With a thought, Jacob brought 2 fingers together and made a gesture before yelling, "Go!" The gray sword energy traveled through his fingers before shooting out of the window and up into the sky. In the dark night, the whitish-gray sword energy had a tail trailing behind it like a flare. The sword energy entered the clouds in the sky, but Jacob could still feel the connection with it, and could even sense the clouds. The sword energy continued to soar and instantly penetrated layers of clouds. Disturbed by it, the lightning started to form. Muffled thunders boomed in the sky, and Jacob hurriedly called back the sword energy as he felt a pressure in his chest. So far, the sword energy couldn't make turns yet. Therefore, it dropped with the same route it had when it went up into the sky. A surge of burning energy traveled from the center of his palm into his heart. He looked down and saw a red mark on the acupoint in the center of his palm, as if he had been burned. The power of the lightning. Jacob endured the pain and realized that the sword energy had brought back the energy of the lightning from the clouds. The nature essence in his body seemed to have been activated by the pure lightning power. It began to boil. Episode 180, The Second Opening. Meanwhile, a lightning bolt flashed in the clouds, lighting up the whole sky. Jacob felt lucky, since he had withdrawn the sword energy from the clouds. If his sword energy, the natal treasure connected with his spirit, had been damaged, he would also have been wounded and would have at least spat out a mouthful of blood. The red mark on the acupoint in the center of his palm gradually disappeared. He hurriedly transferred the pure energy of the lightning into his own nature essence, feeling that his whole body was soaked in the stimulation of the lightning. Suddenly, another opening appeared in the dragon core in his body. The magnificent nature essence from the outside entered Jacob's body like a whirlpool, and the car even shook under its force. Half a minute later, the new opening on the dragon core was finally full of essence and became stable. Meanwhile, Jacob felt like the connection between him and nature seemed to be sharper. At this moment, a drizzle began. The temperature in the courtyard dropped, and Jacob, who was sitting in the car, felt the chill. In the room, about a dozen meters away, Sophie tossed and turned in her bed and couldn't sleep either under the dim yellow light from the lamp. Sophie rolled into a ball with the quilt around her on the bed that was made from hard boards, observing her surroundings. After some thinking, she got up and put on her shoes. Seeing it was drizzling outside, she picked up an umbrella from the corner of the room and cautiously walked into the courtyard. Sitting in the car, Jacob was cultivating with his eyes closed, trying to solidify his realm. Sophie walked to the car and knocked on the window. "Hey, what's the matter?" Jacob was surprised to see her. "Aren't you cold out here?" Sophie opened the door and got in the car. "It's raining. Why did you come outside? You'll catch a cold." Jacob looked at her and said with concern. Sophie didn't answer. She curled up her legs and sat in the back seat beside Jacob. Jacob thought for a while and finally understood. Sophie couldn't sleep alone in a strange place, just like she hadn't been able to sleep alone at Liam's place. "Do you want me to keep you company in the room?" Jacob asked slowly. Finally, Sophie turned to look at him and gave a little nod. Her eyes sparkled like two innocent diamonds in the dark night. Jacob smiled. Placing his hand lightly on her shoulder, he nudged her out of the car before following her. He took a cushion from the car and held up the umbrella before walking Sophie to the room. The room was warmer than the courtyard. Jacob tossed the cushion onto the cold marble floor before sitting down on it cross-legged. Sophie froze. She had not meant to let Jacob sleep on the floor. Seeing that he was already on the floor, she had no choice but to get back into the bed with a frown. She didn't want Jacob to be uncomfortable on the cold floor, but don't know why she always had a hard time conveying her thoughts to him. She always felt speechless around him unless they were bickering or being playful. Time ticked away while the drizzle continued. With Jacob at her side, Sophie now had more control over her thoughts. Meanwhile, Jacob silently felt the second opening on his dragon core. He found that the nature essence circulated faster in his body, and he could use more essence at a time. Even the sword energy in his palm seemed to have a more solid shape. Lying on the bed, Sophie suddenly cleared her throat. Jacob turned to look at her. Can you sleep on the bed?" Sophie stammered while her shining eyes avoided Jacob's. "Are you sure?" Jacob asked casually. Sophie's face turned burning red. She was already having a hard time talking to him right now. "I mean, the bed is not that small. I can give you half of it," Sophie said. Jacob thought for a while before standing up from the floor and climbing onto the bed. In Sophie's home, the floors were covered by carpets, and it wasn't cold to sleep on them. But in this house, the floor was paved with cold marble, and it was very uncomfortable to sleep on it, even though Jacob had the cushion he brought from the car. She pulled the quilt tightly around her body and shifted to lie on her side, with her back to Jacob. After sitting so long on the hard floor, Jacob found that it was a lot more comfortable to sleep on the bed. He lay on his side facing the wall with his back to Sophie. The atmosphere between them was still a bit awkward. Soon, Jacob's breathing became even and long. Sophie turned silently and sat up slowly to look at him over her shoulder. She tried to determine if he had really fallen asleep. After seeing that Jacob didn't move for half a minute, she was certain that he was asleep. When she moved back, a thought occurred to her. When she was hovering over Jacob, if he had suddenly woken up and reached out, she would have landed in his arms. This thought made her face red again, and she moved back and pulled the quilt around her immediately. Lying on her side with her back several centimeters away from Jacob, she bit hard on her lip.
"Forget it. No one would know anyway,"
Sophie consoled herself before falling asleep. General Arthur peeked through the crack of the door when he passed the room. Immediately, he covered his eyes with his hands and silently murmured, before resuming his patrol in the courtyard,
"I saw nothing. I saw nothing."
When Sophie woke up in the morning, she found that she was alone in the room. She looked at Jacob's side and saw a slight dent in the bed, showing that he hadn't moved during the night. Sophie opened her bag and changed out of her pajamas. During this time, Jacob was at the hilltop cultivating the Sword Shadow Scroll. After getting the second opening in the Dragon Core, he seemed to have gained some new inspiration. The chaotic sword energy that was made from the 5 elemental sword energies was gradually condensing. The vague gray sword energy now looked like a real sword. The only problem with it was that it was not retractable. The only time it would return to Jacob's body was when it fell straight back down after he shot it high up into the sky. He cultivated on the quiet hilltop almost until noon. Thinking that Sophie would be up by now, he walked down the hill and returned to the old lady's courtyard. The old lady's family were sitting together enjoying their weekend. Grandma had joined them, chatting happily with her friend. Sophie was making rounds unsteadily on an old black bike. The kids were running behind her, having too much fun teaching her how to ride a bike.
"You're finally back. Soph looked for you everywhere early this morning, and you didn't even bring your cell phone,"
Grandma complained to Jacob when she saw him enter the courtyard. "Well, I just went to the nearby hills for a walk." The moment he said this, Sophie's bike crashed toward him unsteadily. Jacob gave the bike a gentle push, so it passed him instead of crashing into him. Sophie didn't seem to be getting bored without him.
"Ah!"
Sophie tried to turn, but it was too late for her. She rode directly toward the front wall of the yard. She could only make small turns in the yard. When Jacob pushed the bike forward, it sped up and was too fast for her to make a turn, so she crashed toward the short wall. In a big stride, Jacob reached out and picked her up from the bike before it crashed into the corner. Sophie huffed at yet another failed attempt to ride a bike, but she didn't give up. She made sure to shoot a thankful smile to Jacob before walking forward to pick up the bike. After lunch, it was almost time for Jacob and Sophie to return home. Grandma was reluctant to let Soph go, but she was comfortable here and didn't want to return to the city for the time being. Sophie was pleased with the 2-day trip in which she not only ate the yams she baked herself, but learned how to ride a bike as well, though it had been quite painful in the beginning when Jacob wasn't around to prevent the falls. Sitting in the car, Jacob waved goodbye to the old lady's family and his grandma. He drove the car onto the road outside of the village before entering the freeway. Soft music floated in the car and pulled Sophie into a nap immediately. Jacob kept stealing glances at her to make sure she was comfortable while trying to focus on the road. They returned to the city safely, and Jacob drove directly to Sophie's home. Both Dracon and Helen were home. It seemed like they knew that Jacob and Sophie would return, since they had prepared dinner for them already. As Dracon predicted, the people from the South Atlantic Dragon Palace stayed 2 more days in their city and fought a small-scale battle with them. They had at least 30 so-called practices with each other, and ended with light injuries on 3 elders from South Atlantic and moderate injuries on 7 elders from North Atlantic. By gaining the upper hand, they got the revenge they wanted. Since Jacob and Sophie were out of the city, they were not engaged in the battle. Now, South Atlantic had withdrawn their forces, and things began to settle down a bit.
Jacob, you can go with me to the Dragon Palace today. Now that you are on the first level, I think you must choose a natal treasure as soon as possible.
Sitting down at the dinner table, Dracon said, after a moment of consideration.